Mark Reynolds had never thought of himself as the sentimental type, yet every time he set foot on the small parcel of land he had inherited from his father, a quiet solemnity overcame him, something deeper than nostalgia, something that belonged more to history than to memory. The property was not large, and it was not particularly valuable in the eyes of developers, but it carried a weight that no appraisal could capture, because at the center of it stood a stone monument erected decades earlier by his father and several of his fellow servicemen. The monument was simple, a tall rectangular obelisk carved from rough gray granite with the names of fallen soldiers etched carefully across its surface, names that Mark had memorized as a boy even before he understood the circumstances of their deaths. His father had served in a unit that had lost nearly half of its men in a distant conflict, and when he returned, battered but alive, he had gathered the surviving comrades and chosen this piece of land to preserve their memory. Over the years, the place became more than a private memorial. It became a kind of unspoken sanctuary, visited occasionally by veterans, widows, and even strangers who happened to know the story. Mark, trained as an architect, often came here not only to honor his father, but also to think through designs for his projects, sketching while sitting on the small bench beside the obelisk, letting the silence of the grounds clear his mind in a way no office or city park ever could. Since his father's death 5 years earlier, Mark had taken on the quiet responsibility of maintaining the memorial, repairing the low iron fence, replacing wilted flowers, and cutting back the grass that seemed always eager to overtake the stone. He did this without fanfare, without posting photographs or inviting others to applaud him, because he knew his father would have despised gestures made for appearances. What mattered was the persistence of memory, the simple act of guarding a story that might otherwise vanish into archives. The neighbors respected the place without entirely understanding it. Some waved at Mark when they saw him arrive on weekends. Some kept their distance as if the solemnity of the land did not permit casual conversation. For Mark, that was fine. He was not a recluse, but the memorial demanded a quiet kind of devotion that was incompatible with social chatter, and he carried out his caretaking with steady hands and an inward gaze. The surrounding area, however, had changed. What had once been rural outskirts was now under steady pressure from developers who saw every field and grove as potential subdivisions. Billboards appeared advertising future housing communities, and the roads grew busier with surveyors and trucks, each claiming their projects would revitalize the county. Mark knew that his land, though small, stood directly in the path of this expansion, a stubborn rectangle of green amid plotted grids of future construction. Still, he assumed the memorial's existence, combined with the clarity of his ownership documents, made it untouchable. He had papers signed by the county decades ago confirming his father's possession of the land, and tucked in his father's files he had even found a letter from the Department of Defense acknowledging the site as a place of remembrance, a token. Recognition given to certain unofficial memorials built by veterans. None of that carried monetary value, but to Mark it was ironclad proof that the land's significance could never be erased by something as mundane as zoning. On warm evenings he would linger there until dusk, watching the sun slide low over the grass while the granite face of the monument glowed faintly in the fading light. Sometimes he imagined the men whose names were carved into the stone, young once, full of ordinary hopes, never guessing that their legacy would be preserved in such a modest place. Sometimes he thought of his father kneeling in the dirt with the other veterans, setting the base of the stone into the ground, insisting that memory had to be anchored somewhere physical lest it drift away into abstraction. These thoughts were not grand or ceremonial. They were simply part of Mark's rhythm, part of the way he integrated past and present into his daily life. For him, the land was never a burden or a relic, but rather a living dialogue between grief, gratitude, and the quiet strength of continuity. If there was one shadow in all of this, it was the growing sense that outsiders did not see what he saw. To them, the land was only an asset, a corner lot with potential. When he overheard developers speak in the diner, pointing at maps and discussing parcels ready for clearing, he felt a distant unease, but he told himself that his case was different. His father's monument stood like an anchor against time and change, and Mark clung to the belief that some things were still respected in the modern world. He could not have known then how fragile that assumption was, nor how quickly the certainty of ownership and memory could be challenged by those bold enough to fabricate authority and reckless enough to treat sacred ground as if it were just another obstacle in their expansion plans. It was a Saturday morning in early spring when the sound first reached him, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground before his ears could even register it properly. Mark was kneeling near the base of the obelisk, pulling at stubborn weeds that had grown too close to the foundation stones, when the vibration became unmistakable, the heavy thrum of industrial machinery. He straightened slowly, wiping his palms against his jeans, and turned toward the dirt road that connected his land to the highway. A yellow bulldozer was crawling down the path, its broad blade glinting in the sun, followed by a smaller truck carrying men in orange safety vests. They moved with a sense of purpose, not like lost workers who had taken a wrong turn, but like a team arriving at the exact place they intended to be. For a brief moment, Mark thought they must be surveying a nearby lot, maybe mistaken about boundaries. But then the bulldozer stopped just beyond his fence and one of the men jumped down, unlatching the gate as if it were his own. Mark called out immediately, his voice carrying across the open space. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The man did not answer at once. Instead, another figure climbed out of the truck, this one not wearing a vest but a crisp, tailored suit entirely out of place in the dirt. He walked with slow confidence, carrying a clipboard, and when he reached the gate, he smiled with the thin, professional politeness of someone who had rehearsed his lines long before this moment. "Mr. Reynolds?" he asked as though he already knew the answer. Mark nodded cautiously. "My name is Harry Moore," the man continued. "I'm the director of the Homeowners Association for this district. We're here to begin preliminary clearing on this lot, which has been designated for community redevelopment. I assume you received the notices?" The words hit Mark like a blow, not because they carried immediate physical threat, but because of the complete certainty with which they were delivered, as though ownership of the land had shifted overnight. Without his knowledge, he stepped closer to the fence, keeping his tone firm but not raised. "This is my land," he said. "There must be some mistake. This isn't under any association's jurisdiction." Moore's smile widened slightly, the kind of expression used by men who deal in contracts and loopholes, a smile that pretends to be understanding but carries the undertone of dismissal. He lifted a sheaf of papers from the clipboard, tapped them neatly against his palm, and held them up for Mark to see. "According to our records," he said, "this property falls under the governance of our HOA bylaws. There have been multiple infractions noted: failure to maintain structures according to standards, unauthorized monuments, neglected grounds. The board has voted to proceed with demolition in order to bring the area into compliance. You'll find the details outlined here." Mark felt a surge of heat rise to his face. The language Moore used was not only absurd, but insulting, reducing his father's memorial to the status of an unauthorized monument, treating sacred history as though it were a garden shed built without a permit. He reached through the fence and snatched the papers, scanning them quickly. They bore official-looking seals, paragraphs of dense legal text, and a signature line naming the Homeowners Association of Pine Valley Estates. He had never heard of Pine Valley Estates. His land predated most of the modern subdivisions by decades. He looked up sharply. "This is fraudulent," he said. "My documents are clear. This property has been in my family since the 70s, and it was recognized as a memorial site. You can't touch it." Moore did not flinch. His composure remained intact, though his eyes hardened slightly. "Mr. Reynolds," he said smoothly, I understand this must be difficult for you, but the jurisdiction of the HOA has been expanded. Boundaries have changed. Whether you like it or not, your lot now falls within the community's oversight. Our goal is improvement, modernization, progress. Surely you don't want to stand in the way of that. Behind him, the men in vests began unloading tools from the truck, moving toward the fence with the casual efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The bulldozer's engine rumbled louder, as though it too were impatient to proceed. Mark moved quickly to block the gate, planting himself in the center. His voice rose, sharper now. You set one foot on this property with that machine, and you'll be trespassing. I don't care what papers you wave around. This is my land, and that monument is protected. For the first time, Moore's smile faltered. He signaled with a subtle wave of his hand, and the workers paused, looking uncertain. The man in the suit leaned slightly closer, lowering his tone so only Mark could hear. You're making this harder than it needs to be. These things are never personal. Compliance is the smooth path. Resistance, well, it brings complications. I'd advise you to reconsider. The words were quiet, but their weight was unmistakable. Mark felt a chill despite the warm sunlight. This was not simply a misunderstanding of paperwork. These men were prepared to take his land by force of intimidation and forged authority, betting on the assumption that he would yield rather than face the labyrinth of legal battles. He folded the papers, slid them into his jacket, and met Moore's gaze with steady eyes. You're not touching anything today, he said. Not one stone, not one blade of grass. Leave now. There was a long silence, broken only by the low idle of the bulldozer. Moore studied him for several seconds, then gave a small shrug, as though indulging a stubborn child. Very well, he said. He turned to his men. Pack it up for now. The workers obeyed without question, returning to the truck. The bulldozer backed slowly down the path, its retreating noise grinding against Mark's nerves like sandpaper. Before stepping into the vehicle, Moore gave him one final look. We'll be in touch, Mr. Reynolds. Don't mistake this delay for defeat. The process has already begun. Then he was gone, the convoy disappearing into the distance, leaving behind only churned dust and the echo of authority falsely claimed. Mark stood at the gate long after the sound faded, clutching the fraudulent documents in his fist. His heart was still pounding, not only from anger but from the unnerving realization that these men had come prepared, with equipment, paperwork, and a rehearsed narrative. This was not a random scam. It was a coordinated effort, deliberate and dangerous. For the first time, he felt the ground beneath his father's memorial tremble, not from the weight of machinery but from the possibility that memory itself could be erased by those bold enough to rewrite the rules. The following days unfolded like a slow tightening of a vise. Mark woke each morning with the uneasy expectation that another truck would appear at the gate, another set of men with tools ready to dismantle what his father had built. For a brief moment he thought perhaps his confrontation with Harry Moore had been enough to deter them, that his refusal to yield had drawn a boundary they would hesitate to cross. But by the middle of the week, a large envelope arrived in his mailbox, the kind of official packaging designed to intimidate before a single word was read. Inside was a stack of notices printed on heavy paper with embossed headers declaring, Homeowners Association, Pine Valley Estates. The documents cited violations ranging from failure to obtain permission for erecting permanent structures to non-compliant landscaping. At the bottom of one page was a figure, $25,000 in accrued fines, followed by the statement that unpaid penalties could result in foreclosure and compulsory sale of the property. Mark read the words 3 times, each more surreal than the last. His land was not part of any such community, and yet here it was in black ink, laid out as though the decision had already been made without his participation. He drove to the county office the next morning, carrying both the fraudulent documents and the original deed he had inherited from his father. The building, a low structure of faded bricks and buzzing fluorescent lights, was a place he had visited only rarely, but he assumed that here, in the realm of official records, the truth would be unassailable. The clerk at the property desk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched low on her nose, listened politely as he explained, then typed his parcel number into the computer. Her brow furrowed almost immediately. "According to our database," she said, "your lot was annexed into Pine Valley Estates last year." She turned the screen slightly to show him. There it was, his property shaded in digital red, neatly folded into the boundaries of a subdivision he had never heard of. Mark felt his stomach lurch. "That's impossible," he said. "This land has been in my family since 1974. It's a memorial site. Look." He placed the deed on the counter, the paper yellowed with age but stamped with the official seal. The clerk adjusted her glasses, examined it carefully, then glanced back at her screen with visible unease. "This doesn't match what we have," she admitted softly. "Maybe it's a mistake in the system. I'll file an inquiry, but I can't promise when it will be reviewed." "These things can take time." Her hesitation carried more weight than the words themselves. Mark saw in her eyes the reluctance of someone who had learned not to press too deeply into matters that seemed tangled. "And, in the meantime?" he asked. She hesitated again, then lowered her voice. "If they've filed notices, you should take them seriously. The HOA in this area, they have influence." Influence, such a thin word to cover such a dangerous reality. He thanked her and left. But as he walked out of the building, he felt the first stirrings of real fear. That evening, when he returned to the property, his fear hardened into fury. The gate was unlocked, though he knew he had fastened it. The grass near the obelisk was trampled. Fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the soil, and the bronze plaque listing the names of his father's fallen comrades was missing. Only the scarred stone face of the obelisk remained, the empty rectangle where the plaque had been ripped away, leaving behind jagged holes. Mark dropped to his knees, running his fingers across the raw stone as though by touch he could restore what was gone. His mind reeled. Who would do this, and why? The answer formed with sickening clarity. This was not random vandalism. It was deliberate, calculated. The plaque had been removed to reduce the memorial to just another anonymous stone slab, easier to dismiss as unauthorized construction rather than a recognized site of remembrance. He spent hours searching the surrounding grass, ditches, even the roadside, hoping it had simply been thrown aside. But it was nowhere. By the time the sun fell, Mark stood in the dim light of his headlights staring at the monument, his fists clenched, his breathing unsteady. He felt as though a part of his father had been stolen, erased in silence while the world continued on, oblivious. The next day, he returned to the county office, demanding to speak with someone higher than a clerk. He was directed to a supervisor, a man with a polished smile and the kind of practiced charm that comes from years in bureaucratic office. Mark laid the fraudulent documents on his desk, side by side with the original deed and the letter from the Department of Defense. "This land was given to my father's unit as a memorial site," Mark explained, his voice taut with restrained anger. "These papers claiming annexation are fake. I need to know who authorized them." The supervisor leafed through the stack, nodding occasionally, then sat back with a sigh. "Mr. Reynolds, I can see this is important to you. But, according to the system, Pine Valley Estates filed proper annexation documents. They were stamped and accepted by the county. If you believe fraud has occurred, you'll need to challenge it in court." Mark leaned forward. "You're telling me my father's memorial can be erased because someone filed papers? And no one checks if they're real?" The supervisor spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Procedures were followed. That's all I can say. His tone was sympathetic but hollow, like a man who had long ago learned that survival in office meant never digging beneath the surface. When Mark stepped back into the sunlight outside, the papers tucked once more under his arm, he realized that the confrontation had moved beyond bureaucratic mishap. The enemy was not a faceless error in a database, but an organized group willing to manipulate records, break into private land, and strip away history. The escalation was no longer subtle. It was direct, invasive, and meant to exhaust him until he surrendered. That night he sat in his small kitchen, staring at the documents spread across the table, the absence of the plaque weighing heavier than the papers themselves. He remembered his father telling him once that battles are not always fought with rifles, that sometimes the enemy wears suits and ties, sometimes they carry clipboards instead of weapons, and sometimes the terrain is not a battlefield but a courtroom. Mark had not understood then. Now he did. And as he gathered the papers back into a folder, sliding them carefully beside his father's letter, a quiet resolve settled over him. He knew the coming weeks would not be a test of force, but of endurance, a war of attrition fought through filings, hearings, and the shadows of influence. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Surrender was not an option. Mark's search for clarity drove him deeper into the tangle of archives and records than he had ever expected. The disappearance of the bronze plaque had left him shaken, but also sharpened his focus. Whoever was behind this scheme was not improvising. They had planned each step, replacing reverence with paperwork and memory with manufactured jurisdiction. He realized that in order to defend his father's memorial, he could not simply confront the men who showed up at his gate or argue with county clerks who hid behind the shield of procedure. He needed proof that carried a weight beyond local manipulation, evidence rooted in the very history the monument had been built to honor. The county archives were housed in a low stone building at the edge of town, its hallways smelling of dust and aging paper. Mark spent long hours in its quiet reading room, combing through boxes of property deeds, maps, and correspondence. He had already seen the deed his father left him, but now he sought corroboration, anything that connected the memorial to official recognition. After 2 full days of searching, he uncovered a slim folder marked with a date from the early 1980s. Inside was a letter on Department of Defense letterhead, its type faded but legible. The letter addressed his father by name, acknowledging his request to dedicate the parcel as a memorial for his fallen unit. It did not transfer ownership. The land had already been his father's, but it recognized the site as one of significance to veterans of the conflict, and offered a measure of federal protection under certain preservation statutes. Mark felt his throat tighten as he read. His father had never spoken of this letter, perhaps out of humility, perhaps because to him the stone spoke louder than any paper. But here was the anchor Mark needed, tangible evidence that the memorial was more than a personal gesture, that it carried meaning acknowledged at the highest level. Yet, tucked into the same folder was another document, filed decades later, claiming that the protective recognition had lapsed. The formatting was different, the font modern, the language oddly generic. Where the original DoD letter carried signatures, seals, and careful phrasing, this one was almost crude in its simplicity, as though produced by someone imitating the appearance of officialdom without understanding its nuance. The date on the page was from just last year. Mark felt a chill. This was no coincidence. Someone had deliberately inserted a fraudulent document into the official archive to nullify the original recognition, creating the illusion that the memorial's protection had expired. He turned the paper over in his hands, noting the faint chemical smell of ink too fresh for something meant to be decades old. He brought the discovery to the archivist, a man with thinning hair and nervous eyes who had guided him toward the correct boxes. When Mark placed both documents on the desk, the archivist leaned forward, squinting, then looked around the empty room before lowering his voice. "This one," he said, tapping the modern sheet, "wasn't here last year. I know because I reorganized this section myself. It appeared in the catalog after routine update, but it was filed without the standard registry code, which should not happen. His words trailed off as if he regretted speaking them aloud. "Can you remove it?" Mark asked. The man shook his head quickly. "If I alter the files, I could lose my position. You have to understand, changes like this, they come from above. Someone wanted this inserted. I can't tell you who. All I can suggest is that you keep copies of everything, especially the original letter." His eyes darted again toward the door. "And be careful who you confront. Some things are not meant to be questioned openly." Mark left with photocopies of both letters, his mind racing. The fraud was no longer limited to fabricated fines or boundary maps. It had reached into the very core of official records, rewriting history with forged paper. That meant the enemy had access, influence, and the confidence that no one would scrutinize the changes. But they had underestimated one thing: his refusal to let go. In the following week, Mark sought out a legal perspective. A colleague from his architectural practice referred him to a local attorney, Evelyn Carter, known for her tenacity in property disputes. Evelyn was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, direct in speech but meticulous in thought. When Mark laid the documents across her desk, she listened without interruption, then studied them in silence. Finally, she spoke. "You're dealing with an operation that has resources and strategy. The insertion of forged documents into a county archive is not the work of amateurs. If this HOA is not even a legally incorporated entity, then they're running a front, probably to pressure landowners into surrendering valuable property. Your memorial is standing in the way of a development project, which means they won't stop. But this letter from the Department of Defense, this is powerful. It ties your land to federal recognition, and that is outside the jurisdiction of any HOA, fake or otherwise. If we can authenticate it formally, it changes everything." Mark asked how. Evelyn leaned back, tapping the paper lightly. "We'll need to contact the department itself, request confirmation from their archives. It's a slow process, but once verified, no county office, no fabricated association can override it. The challenge will be surviving the pressure they apply in the meantime. They'll try to break you before the verification arrives." Her words were not comforting, but they were honest, and Mark valued that more than false reassurance. As if to prove her prediction correct, the very next day he returned to the memorial and found fresh markers staked into the soil. Survey flags in bright orange, lined in a precise grid that ran directly over the obelisk's position. Attached to one flag was a laminated sign reading, "Future Site Evaluation, Pine Valley Estates, HOA." It was a message written not for the public but for him alone, a declaration that they intended to proceed regardless of his resistance. Mark pulled the flags from the earth one by one, snapping the thin plastic rods in his hands, his anger rising with each crack. When he was done, he tossed them in a heap beside the fence, breathing hard, his resolve hardening further. That evening he returned to Evelyn's office with the broken flags as physical evidence. She studied them briefly, then placed them aside. "These are intimidation tactics," she said, "but intimidation leaves traces. Each of these has a serial number for inventory purposes. We can track where they came from, and if they were purchased by a company tied to this so-called HOA, it strengthens your case." She leaned closer, her eyes steady. "But you need to understand, Mark. Once you push back, they will escalate. You've already seen what they did with the plaque. They'll come after you next, not just the land." Her warning stayed with him long into the night. Sitting in his kitchen once more, Mark unfolded the original due letter and placed it on the table. His father's name stared back at him from the faded type, a reminder of why this fight mattered. This was no longer about property value or legal jurisdiction. It was about memory and truth against erasure and fraud. He felt the lines of battle shift inside him. He was not simply defending land. He was defending the integrity of his father's sacrifice, of men whose names had been carved into stone so they would never be forgotten. That realization gave him the clarity he needed. He would not retreat, no matter how deep the forgery ran or how intimidating the tactics became. The midpoint of his struggle had revealed the scale of the enemy's reach, but it had also shown him the weapon they could never counterfeit: the authenticity of lived memory, anchored in history and preserved in the granite of a monument that would not bow to bulldozers or paperwork. The weeks that followed unfolded with a rhythm of constant tension, each day bringing a new sign that the opposition was not retreating but tightening its grip. Mark had sent Evelyn copies of every forged document and the Department of Defense letter, and she had begun the process of contacting federal offices to obtain authentication. But bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, and in that vacuum of waiting, the pressure mounted in ways designed not just to challenge his ownership, but to exhaust his resolve. The first sign was subtle: notices taped to his front door at home, claiming violations unrelated to the land itself, absurdly citing improper refuse disposal and non-compliant exterior lighting. He lived in a modest townhouse in the city where no HOA had jurisdiction, yet the letters carried the same fabricated seal of Pine Valley Estates. It was a reminder that the reach of his adversaries extended beyond the memorial site, that they intended to disrupt his daily life and blur the boundaries between truth and fiction until fatigue wore him down. Soon, the tactics escalated from paper to presence. One evening, as Mark returned from work, he noticed a white SUV parked across the street from his townhouse, its engine idling. Inside were two men, one pretending to scroll through his phone, the other staring openly at Mark as he unlocked his door. They did not move, did not speak. But when Mark came back outside an hour later, the SUV was still there, headlights off but engine running. It followed him for several blocks the next morning before peeling away into traffic. He considered reporting it to the police, but Evelyn advised caution. "Without a license plate or an overt act, they'll dismiss it," she said. "And sometimes the attempt to file a report only alerts them that you're rattled. Don't give them that satisfaction. Document everything, but don't engage." Her advice was sound, yet it did little to ease the gnawing anxiety. When he returned to the memorial the following weekend, the anxiety sharpened into rage. The gate had been forced open, the grass churned by heavy tires, and spray-painted across the base of the obelisk were the words, "Unauthorized." The crude red letters scarred the granite like a wound. Mark stood before it, fists clenched, his chest tight. He had seen vandalism before in the city, tags on walls or bridges, but this was different. This was not the random act of a bored teenager. It was a message, calculated and direct, meant to strip the stone of its dignity and humiliate him by turning sacred ground into a canvas of contempt. He spent hours scrubbing the paint away, his hands raw and trembling by the time the granite was clean again, though faint stains lingered like shadows. He took photographs of the damage and brought them to Evelyn. She studied them with a grim expression. "This is no longer just intimidation. It's criminal trespass and vandalism. But the problem is proof. Unless we catch them in the act, prosecution will be difficult, and they know that." She leaned forward. "This is how they escalate. They strike, they retreat. They make you waste energy repairing what they've damaged while they prepare the next blow. The goal is not only to take your land, but to break your spirit before the court ever sees the case." The next blow arrived days later in the form of a letter not from the fabricated HOA, but from a real financial institution. It claimed his mortgage, long since paid, had been refinanced without his knowledge, and that he now owed substantial payments. Mark felt the floor drop beneath him as he read the letter, until Evelyn confirmed that this was another tactic, a fraudulent filing meant to mire him in confusion. "They're expanding the battlefield," she said. "If they can overwhelm you with enough fronts, the memorial becomes just one more problem. But we'll counter it. Stay focused on the central fight." Despite her confidence, Mark felt the isolation deepen. Friends who once visited the memorial with him grew hesitant, fearing involvement in a conflict that seemed to reach into unexpected corners of power. Even his neighbors in the city began to look at him differently, whispering after the white SUV was seen parked outside his home again. The weight of solitude pressed heavily, but it was broken unexpectedly by a group he had not sought: his father's surviving comrades. Word of the escalating harassment had reached them through quiet channels, and one afternoon 3 men arrived at the memorial, walking with the slow, deliberate gait of age but carrying an air of unyielding presence. They were veterans who had stood beside his father when the stone was raised, and their return carried the force of memory embodied. "We heard what they're doing," one said, laying a weathered hand on Mark's shoulder. "This isn't just your fight, it's ours too." The moment shifted something inside Mark. For weeks he had felt hunted and alone, pitted against an invisible network of forged authority. Now he saw that the memory preserved in the stone was not his alone to defend. Others bore its weight too, and their presence strengthened his resolve. They helped him resecure the fence, clean the grounds, and stand watch for signs of intrusion. When the spray-painted word "unauthorized" reappeared days later, it was already expected, and this time the veterans joined him in scrubbing the granite until the stone shone again, silent and proud. The escalation had moved from paperwork to intimidation, from quiet forgery to overt desecration, but in responding to it, Mark had found what his adversaries could not counterfeit: solidarity rooted in shared memory. He knew the fight was far from over. If anything, this wave of attacks was only preparation for the decisive confrontation to come. But for the first time, as he locked the gate that evening with the veterans beside him, he felt that the weight pressing against him was no longer his alone to carry. The courtroom was smaller than Mark expected, yet the air inside felt thick with the weight of consequence. Months of intimidation, forged documents, and desecration had led to this moment, and as he sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn, he felt both exhausted and sharper than he had ever been, like steel hammered by relentless blows. Across the aisle sat Harry Moore, no longer in the polished confidence of a suit worn on a sunlit morning by the gate, but in the calculated composure of a man who believed he could still manipulate perception. Beside him were 2 lawyers, sleek in appearance but with eyes that betrayed unease. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair pulled tightly back, called the room to order, and the case that had seemed impossible to navigate began in the measured cadence of legal procedure. The lawyers for the so-called HOA spoke first, presenting their stack of documents with rehearsed certainty. They described Mark's land as abandoned, unmaintained, and improperly annexed into Pine Valley Estates according to filed ordinances. They displayed maps with redrawn boundaries, notices of violations, even the fraudulent letter claiming the Department of Defense recognition had lapsed. Their tone was one of inevitability, as though the court had only to rubber stamp a decision already made. But when Evelyn rose, her calm voice carried a weight that cut through the veneer of authority. She placed the original DOD letter on the table, then lifted it for the judge to see, her words deliberate. "This is not rumor or sentimental claim. This is a federal document issued in 1983, recognizing Mr. Reynolds' land as a memorial site for veterans of conflict. Its authenticity has been confirmed directly by the Department of Defense archives in Washington. It has never lapsed, never been rescinded. And any claim to the contrary is a fabrication." She then produced the fraudulent letter inserted into the county files, pointing out its lack of registry number, its incorrect formatting, and its chemical analysis showing modern ink and paper. Gasps murmured faintly through the room as the duplicity became visible, not as allegation but as demonstrable fact. Evelyn did not stop there. She held up the survey flags pulled from the soil of the memorial grounds, each tagged with a serial number that she traced back to a supplier connected to a shell company whose listed director was none other than Harry Moore. The pattern was undeniable: forged documents, trespass, vandalism, intimidation. Piece by piece, she laid them on the record like stones building a wall of truth no amount of rhetoric could topple. When Mark was called to testify, his voice was steady though his chest trembled. He described the history of the memorial, the day his father and his comrades had set the granite stone, the years of quiet caretaking, the desecration he found when the plaque was ripped away and when the word "unauthorized" was scrawled in red. Paint across the stone. He did not embellish, did not attempt to stir emotion. He simply told what had happened, letting the dignity of memory speak louder than anger. Veterans from his father's unit followed, one after another, men whose bodies bore the slow burdens of age but whose voices carried the resonance of truth. They remembered the dedication ceremony, the reading of names, the pride in their fallen brothers. They testified not as experts in law but as witnesses to history, unbroken by time. The opposing lawyers scrambled, attempting to dismiss the memorial as informal, the veterans as biased, the documents as misfiled. But the judge cut them off with sharp questions, demanding explanations for the anomalies in the forged letter, the unexplained annexation of land without registry codes, the link between Moore's shell company and the survey equipment found on Mark's property. Their arguments faltered, their composure cracked. Moore himself, when finally pressed to respond, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, offering vague answers that only deepened the impression of guilt. The judge's ruling came swiftly, her voice firm and clear. The court finds that the so-called annexation of Mr. Reynolds' property into Pine Valley Estates was fraudulent. The documents presented by the defendant are forgeries, and the actions taken by Mr. Moore and his associates constitute trespass, harassment, and attempted unlawful seizure of protected land. The Department of Defense recognition stands. This memorial is not subject to demolition or alteration by any homeowners association, real or fabricated. Furthermore, this case is referred to federal authorities for investigation of criminal conduct. For a moment, the room was utterly silent, the words reverberating like a gavel, striking not just wood, but stone. Mark sat motionless, the release of tension almost unbearable, his throat tight, his eyes fixed on the judge as though to confirm she had truly spoken the words aloud. Then Evelyn's hand rested lightly on his arm, steadying him, grounding him. Across the aisle, Moore's composure collapsed, his lips tightening as the reality of exposure settled over him. The false authority he had worn so confidently now looked brittle, a costume stripped of power. Mark rose slowly, feeling the weight of the months behind him, the memory of his father beside him, the voices of the veterans who had stood by him. The climax of his struggle had not been a physical clash at the gate, not a desperate standoff against machinery, but this, truth laid bare in the calm but unyielding language of law. And in that moment he understood what his father had once told him, that some battles are fought not on battlefields but in rooms like this, with paper instead of weapons, with patience instead of force, and yet the victory was no less profound. In the weeks after the verdict, the silence around the memorial felt different, no longer the silence of anticipation and dread, but of peace slowly returning to ground that had been defended. The fraudulent notices stopped arriving. The SUV no longer idled near his home, and the phone calls filled with veiled threats ceased as though the entire apparatus of intimidation had dissolved once its leaders were exposed to the scrutiny of law. Federal investigators took over the matter, and Mark heard little about their progress except that charges were being prepared against Moore and those who had enabled him. But that was enough. What mattered most was that the stone remained standing, untouched, its dignity restored, its history secured by more than memory now, by judgment written into law. Mark returned to the memorial often, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by the veterans who had testified, men who treated the site not as his possession, but as a shared sanctuary. Together they restored the plaque, polished the granite, and resealed the fence. their labor carried out in silence, broken only by the sound of tools and the rustle of grass. When the work was finished, they gathered without ceremony, a small circle around the obelisk, and one of the older men whispered the names etched into the bronze as if reciting them might keep them alive a moment longer. Mark felt then that the struggle had never been about defeating an enemy so much as preserving a truth, ensuring that memory was not erased by fraud or buried under the weight of false authority. On the next anniversary of his father's unit, more people came than he had ever seen before. Neighbors, relatives, even strangers who had read about the case and felt compelled to stand among the veterans. The obelisk glowed in the afternoon light, its surface no longer scarred by paint or absence but whole again, a monument to endurance. As Mark stood beside it, he felt not triumph but steadiness, the quiet knowledge that some places must be defended no matter the cost, because they anchor more than land. They anchor the meaning of sacrifice itself. And as the voices around him rose in remembrance, he understood that the story of the memorial would outlast not only him, but those who had tried to destroy it, because truth, once defended, does not yield easily to silence.